Good afternoon. Thank you, Rahil Raza. As always, you make a compelling case for the need for Islam to reform today. My name is Maajid Nawaz. I stand here before you, as you heard in the introduction, as somebody who spent many years of my life, in particular during the period of my teenage years and into my early to mid-20s, as a man who campaigned against secularism, as an Islamist theocrat, in fact, as somebody who rejected secularism and liberalism and democracy as being something akin to apostasy within Islam. The verdict and the ruling that I had adopted was that any Muslim who willingly and wholeheartedly ascribes to secularism, liberalism, and democracy has in fact apostatized from the religion of Islam. Yet, I now stand here before you as a soon-to-be 39-year-old man, having founded Quilliam. You heard Rahil just refer to Quilliam. I am founding chairman of Quilliam. It's what we like to dub as the world's first counter-extremism organization. Whether it is or not, I leave for you to decide, but we do indeed challenge extremism. We've been doing so for 8 years. In particular, we challenge Islamist extremism. Islamism, as I like to define it, is the desire to impose any version of Islam over society. Yet I also stand here before you as a Muslim. I stand here as well before you as a secularist. I stand here before you as a liberal, and I stand here before you as a Democrat. In fact, I stood as a Liberal Democrat in Hampstead and Kilburn, and I suspect many of you are laughing because you know how that turned out, but I lost. In fact, we lost across the country, and I am now proud to say also I stand there before you as an Honorary Associate of this very national secular society. And the reason I agreed to be, and have been for a while, an Honorary Associate of the National Secular Society is because I firmly believe that Islam and secularism today can be made compatible. I firmly concur with what Rahil has just said, that actually there is plenty of historical and theological precedent for Islam to be compatible with secularism today. And that's why, because it's so important for Muslims to speak out in favor of secularism today, that I agreed to be an Honorary Associate of the National Secular Society. And my mission statement, if I were to summarize it in one sentence, would be that the ideology of Islamism, as I have briefly defined it, the desire to impose any version of Islam over society anywhere, at any time, that ideology of Islamism today must be intellectually terminated, and the religion of Islam today must be reformed. And that person can grab it. It can happen. As I said, there's plenty of historical and theological precedent for why it can happen. My own journey and my own experience standing here before you with, as was introduced, a, let's say, interesting past, demonstrates that one person, if they can go through this transformation in their own mindset, it certainly is possible. But let me point to some of those historical examples of how we as Muslims who know our history and the history of our trajectory as a religion know that it hasn't always been the way it is today. In fact, even if you take your minds back to what is known as the Caliphate, which was a succession of medieval Arab dynasties, in truth, in reality, that's what it was. For all their medieval faults, for all their lack of liberalism, as we would understand it today, and for all their lack of democracy, and certainly there was a lack of liberalism and a lack of democracy, anyone well-versed with history will know that if you look back to the history of those caliphates, the Abbasids, the Umayyads, all of them, they are defined primarily by the fact that they did not enforce one version of what is known as the Sharia over all of society. In fact, the exception to this was in Europe, when the Andalusian Umayyad dynasty adopted the Maliki version of Sharia, enforced it over society in an attempt to build a cohesive society so that it could push back against the Frankish incursions coming from the north. The other exception, again, partly European, were the Ottomans, who in an attempt to reform, being impressed with the canonization of law in Europe and the idea of a unitary legal system, decided to codify the Hanafi version of Sharia and attempted to implement it as law, as state law over society in what was known as the Tanzimat reforms. Those reforms failed. However, before those reforms, the Ottomans had what was known as a millet system, a legally pluralistic system. There was more than one law running at the same time because Sharia was for those Muslims who went to the court for arbitration. Now, I willingly concede that that may not have been liberal and it may not have been democratic. But what Islamists are calling for today, which is the wholesale adoption of one version of Sharia to be enforced over society, at the end of, in many cases, a gun, in other cases, a butcher's knife, is something that is known as an innovation. It is an innovation. And I can point you to even the theology. And by the way, I'll speak a bit about some of the terms in the Quran, but I want to make something absolutely clear so nobody's in any doubt. I am not a devout Muslim. I don't pray every day 5 times a day. I used to. But just to make it clear here, I'm not speaking as a religious leader nor a religious role model. I'm speaking as somebody with an obvious interest in the subject who knows the history and knows how an understanding of the theology changed with the advent of modern Islamism. Islamists today obsess over the notion of creating an Islamic state. The word for a state in Arabic, I also happen to graduate in Arabic, so trust me when I tell you this. The word for a state in Arabic is dawla. And if you were to take a computer program and search the entire Holy Quran and every single hadith in the volumes of collected hadith collections, both those hadith that are known as sahih or verified and those that are known as weak or da'if and everything in between, I guarantee you will not find one reference to the word state or dawla. I promise you that. I've done the search. I memorized half the Quran. I used to preach for an Islamic state for 13 years. Part of my transformation involved coming to this realization. There is not one reference to the word state in the Quran and the Sunnah. And the reason is obvious when you think about it. The very concept of a state didn't exist. If you look at the volumes and volumes of books of jurisprudence that classical Islamic scholars, they opined on everything from how to wash, how to bathe, down to how to get married, how to trade in various forms of currency, whether gold and silver are mandatory for Muslims to trade or you're allowed to trade in copper, known as fulus. They discussed everything. And again, I can guarantee you that at best you'll find 2 books that spoke of what a ruler should do. Didn't speak of a state. It wasn't even called Islamic State. These 2 books, authored by a man called Abu Ala al-Mawardi, Abu al-Hasan al-Mawardi, Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, and Abu Ya'la, who wrote another book, also called Ahkam al-Sultaniyya. The title of the book, The Rules of Governance. They couldn't even call it an Islamic state because they didn't have the concept of a state. The concept of a state is a modern European notion. The idea of a unitary legal system is a thoroughly, entirely modern construct. So not only is the state and the idea of a state missing in Islamic theology, so is the notion of a constitution. You hear Islamists today insist that the constitution must be Islamic. Well, the word for constitution in Arabic is distur. And again, if you were to perform the same hypothetical search throughout the entire Islamic reference books, the Quran and all of the hadith collections, the word constitution simply does not exist. Retrospectively, you could perhaps go back into time and say, these particular theological passages are what form the basis for me wanting to enforce this version of law. This could be seen as a constitution, but the very notion of a constitution is a modern idea. Let's take the word law, known as qanun in Arabic, or qanun al-wad'i, if you want to be technically precise. Placed law is what the Arabs refer to it as. It's placed because it's created. The word qanun is absent in the Quran and hadith collections. And what we often refer to as Sharia law, Sharia being the adjective for the noun law, is again not how Arabs refer to the word. They refer to Sharia as a noun. Sharia is not an adjective to describe the noun law. It's a standalone noun, historically. We heard how the Islamists are using it today from Rahil's video. And the need to speak frankly about this subject is something I hope I'm known for doing. But historically, and in the books of theology, the word Sharia appears as a noun because it means the path to water. That's what it means in the Arabic language. And the fact that when Islam was first translated into English for those Muslims born and raised here like me, and for those Orientalists who are seeking to study the religion, it was translated by those Arabs who were political asylum seekers, many of whom, from which who were concerned with the issue of discussing Islam and modernity, most of whom were Islamists. And so these words, when they were translated laden with assumptions, they stuck in the English lexicon. So whenever you say the word Sharia law, know at least that you're not using it in its proper historic usage. Arabs simply don't say Qanun al-Sharia. They simply say Sharia as a noun. So Islam today can be reformed. There's plenty of historical and theological precedent for doing so, and I'm touching on the tip of the iceberg. In 1925, an incredibly brave and visionary man who happened to be a graduate of Sunni Islam's foremost school of learning in Egypt, who also happened to be a judge in a Sharia court, Ali Abdul Raziq, wrote a book, an Egyptian Azhar theologian, Sunni, Muslim, Arab, in 1925, wrote a book called Usul al-Hukm fil Islam, the basis of ruling in Islam, in which, it's a small pamphlet, you can get English translations of it free online, in which he advocated for an entirely secular state and the separation of religion from politics. Now, he happened to be competing with the Islamists. In 1923, the Muslim Brotherhood was established by Hassan al-Banna in that same country of Egypt. History tells us who lost the fight. But the fact is, that struggle continued. That struggle continued to a point where Abdul Wahab Effendi wrote his book, Who Needs an Islamic State? When Professor Abdullah Naim, a professor of Emory College in the United States, wrote two books, Islam and the Secular State, and also Towards the Islamic Reformation. Academic Islamic theologians who work in this field for a living have long been making the case for secularism and Islam, all the way back to 1925. But they have been losing the argument, and there are two reasons they have been losing this argument. One of them is that the Islamists organized on the grassroots and beat them within Muslim community contexts. I know because we were beating them every day on the streets. The second is because what I call the regressive left, those who are the neo-Orientalists, adopted the arguments of the Islamists, assuming they were Islam, and began defending the Islamists under the name of political correctness, cultural tolerance, and freedom of religion, without recognizing that what they had inadvertently done was adopt Islamism as if it was Islam and argued for freedom of religion when in fact they were arguing for theocracy. What I would argue is that though Islamism needs to be intellectually terminated and Islam today needs to reform, I would argue that secularism is the prerequisite. Secularism must be the first stage. So before we attempt seriously a reform of Islam today, and many aspects of Islam even after secularism will require reform, because if you remember, I said very clearly that historically it doesn't mean it was liberal, and it doesn't mean it was democratic, it was medieval. Today we're not medieval. A lot of things will need to change, even in what normative Islam was. I don't just concede that point, I advocate for it, very publicly. But to achieve that realistically in Muslim majority contexts, secularism must come first. And for secularism to come first, those reformers, those solitary in many instances voices, those voices who risk everything to speak out within Muslim community contexts need to be supported. All of you here need to be able to, and I hope you do, differentiate genuinely between those who are the apologists for Islamism or fundamentalist Islam today, those two not necessarily being the same thing, to differentiate between those apologists and the genuine Muslim reformers. Because sometimes there's a danger that secularists, and especially non-believers, who believe that Islam says something in particular about women's rights, gender rights, or whatever, diversity, pluralism, liberalism, will end up sounding very much like the Islamists when arguing what Islam says, and will end up getting into arguments with reformers themselves who are attempting to reform the situation. And as we know with the history of Christianity in Europe, Christianity is slowly, let's take the Church of England today, where for the first time a gay bishop has declared themselves gay and in a relationship. I just did a whole hour on it for my LBC radio show. So Christianity needed to secularize first, and then it started to liberalize. And what I would put to you is that secularism is the prerequisite for the liberalization of attitudes within Muslim societies. Let's take two cases in point. An example of the guardianship laws in Saudi Arabia and the blasphemy law in Pakistan. If you're going to argue for either of those laws to change, those laws are justified specifically by religion, and they have religious justifications backing them. So to argue for those laws to change, and it's quite clear that with the guardianship laws in Saudi Arabia, without those laws reforming, women cannot move around that country of their own free will. Without the blasphemy laws changing in Pakistan, people cannot question a lot of what we're speaking about here, because they'll be accused of blasphemy, the punishment for which is death. But those two specific laws are justified by religion. And a pragmatic approach would recognize that laws such as these need to be removed before that society can move towards, in earnest, towards that reform process. And to remove them, you will need to be able to make a religious case for their change, because they are defined constitutionally. They are justified by that religion. I hope, and in my concluding remarks, that I stand here before you with a sufficient enough track record and a moral standing to make the case that I've just made and that Raheel has just made, and for you to lend us your support for the continued efforts to challenge and intellectually terminate the ideology of Islamism and then to reform Islam today. Thank you very much.